The apostles' secret trials, why their faith was tested daily. There is something the world rarely talks about when it comes to the apostles. We often remember their miracles, their bold preaching, their unwavering declarations of faith, and the way they walked beside Jesus. But what is almost never spoken about is the invisible war they faced every single day. Not the public persecution, not the lashes or imprisonment, but the silent trials that happened inside their hearts, the kind of battles that no one could see, the kind of battles that happen when faith is not proven in front of crowds, but in the quiet moments when doubt whispers louder than truth. Because the reality is this: the apostles were not just chosen to follow Jesus, they were chosen to be tested constantly. Their faith was not a one-time decision. It was a daily confrontation between what they saw and what they believed. And if you look closely, you will realize something powerful. Their greatest struggles were not external, they were internal. Every day they had to choose faith again. Every day they had to crucify fear, confusion, insecurity, and expectation. And the truth is, if you are walking a spiritual path today, your journey is not so different from theirs, because being chosen has never meant being exempt from struggle. It has always meant being refined through it. Topic 1. The silent war between what they saw and what they believed. The apostles lived in a constant tension that most people today would not be able to endure. On one side, they had what they saw with their natural eyes: storms, hunger, rejection, threats, uncertainty, and the very real possibility of death. On the other side, they had what Jesus told them: promises of the kingdom, victory over death, authority over darkness, and a future they could not yet fully understand. And every single day those two realities clashed inside them. Imagine walking with Jesus, witnessing miracles that defy logic, and yet still feeling fear when the storm rises. This is exactly what happened in the boat. The wind roared, the waves crashed, and even though Jesus was right there with them, asleep, they panicked. Not because they lacked faith completely, but because their faith was being tested in real time. This is the first hidden trial of the apostles, the battle between sight and belief. Because faith is easy when everything is calm. Faith feels strong when miracles are visible. But real faith is revealed when everything around you contradicts what you believe. And this is where their daily struggle began. Peter, for example, is often remembered for his boldness. He stepped out of the boat. He walked on water. But what many overlook is what happened next. He began to sink. Why? Because his attention shifted. In one moment, his focus was on Jesus. In the next, it was on the wind. And that is the exact nature of this silent trial. Faith requires focus, but life constantly tries to steal that focus. The apostles were not superhuman. They felt the same fear, the same confusion, the same internal conflict that anyone would feel. The difference is that they kept choosing to return to faith, again and again, even after failing, even after doubting, even after misunderstanding. And that is what made their journey so powerful, because their faith was not perfect, it was persistent. Another example is Thomas. History labeled him as the doubter. But what if we look deeper? What if Thomas represents a struggle that almost every believer faces, but rarely admits? The need for certainty. Thomas did not reject Jesus. He did not abandon the group. He simply said, "I need to see." And in that statement, we see a profound internal battle, because faith, by definition, requires trust without full evidence. And yet the human mind constantly seeks proof. This tension creates a daily trial, a quiet war between the desire to believe and the need to understand. And Jesus' response to Thomas was not condemnation, it was invitation: touch, see, believe. This reveals something crucial. The apostles' struggles were not disqualifications, they were part of the process. Their doubts did not remove them from their calling, they refined it. And the same pattern appears again and again. They misunderstood Jesus' teachings. They argued about who was the greatest. They struggled to grasp the idea of sacrifice. They expected a political kingdom when Jesus was revealing a spiritual one. And every misunderstanding became another layer of testing because their minds had to be transformed. Their expectations had to be broken. Their old beliefs had to die so that new understanding could be born. This is not a comfortable process. It is not instant. It is slow, uncomfortable, and often confusing. And yet, this is exactly how faith becomes real, not through easy answers, but through deep wrestling. The apostles had to unlearn before they could truly learn. They had to let go of control before they could trust fully. And that is where most people struggle today, because we want clarity before commitment. We want understanding before obedience. But the apostles were being trained in something deeper. They were being trained to trust beyond what they could explain. And this created daily pressure inside them. Imagine hearing Jesus say things like, "The last will be first. Lose your life to find it. Love your enemies." These statements go against human instinct. They challenge logic, they disrupt comfort. And every time the apostles heard these words, they were confronted with a choice. Do I accept this truth even if I don't fully understand it? Or do I resist it because it challenges my current mindset? This is the hidden trial, the constant confrontation between divine truth and human reasoning. And this trial does not happen once. It happens every day. Every teaching, every situation, every unexpected moment. And yet, through all of this, something incredible was happening. Their faith was being built not on feelings but on decision, not on circumstances but on commitment, not on clarity but on trust. And that is why their story still resonates today, because the same war exists in every person who seeks a deeper spiritual life. The world shows you one reality: fear, limitation, uncertainty. But faith invites you into another reality, one that cannot always be seen, but must be believed. And the space between those two realities is where the real battle happens. The apostles lived in that space every day, and slowly, through failures, corrections, and persistence, they became stronger. Not because the trials stopped, but because their response to the trials changed. They began to trust faster. They began to recover quicker after doubt. They began to hold on to truth, even when everything around them suggested otherwise. And that is the transformation. Not the absence of struggle, but the growth within it. Because at the end of the day, the greatest test of their faith was not whether they believed in Jesus when things were easy. It was whether they would continue to believe when everything became difficult. When Jesus was arrested, when hope seemed lost, when fear became overwhelming. That was the ultimate confrontation between sight and belief. And yet, even in their failure, even in their moment of fear, the story did not end there. Because faith, when it is real, does not disappear in failure. It is refined by it. And that is the secret trial that shaped the apostles, the daily war between what they saw and what they believed. A war that did not destroy them, but transformed them into something far greater than they ever imagined. There is a hidden weight that comes with being chosen, a burden that is rarely spoken about, but deeply felt by those who walk a path of purpose. The apostles did not just follow Jesus. They were separated from everything they once knew, and that separation was not only physical, it was emotional, psychological, and spiritual. One of the greatest secret trials they faced daily was the tension between who they used to be and who they were becoming. Because being chosen by Jesus did not instantly erase their past identities. It challenged them. It dismantled them. It forced them into a transformation that was as painful as it was necessary. Imagine leaving behind your profession, your family routines, your social identity, and stepping into a life where nothing is predictable. Fishermen who once understood the rhythm of the sea now had to navigate the uncertainty of faith. Tax collectors who once relied on structure and control were now walking in a reality that required complete surrender. This transition was not easy. It created an internal disorientation because the old self does not disappear quietly. It resists, it questions, it tries to hold on. And this is where the daily trial begins. The apostles were constantly confronted with the pull of their former lives, the familiarity of what was known versus the uncertainty of what was ahead. And this tension creates a deep internal struggle, because the human nature craves stability. It seeks comfort. It wants to return to what feels safe, but calling does not allow that. Calling demands movement, it demands growth, it demands sacrifice. And for the apostles, this meant living in a constant state of transition. They were no longer who they used to be, but they were not yet fully who they were meant to become. They existed in the middle. And that middle space is one of the most difficult places to live, because it feels like you belong nowhere. You no longer fit into your old world, but you have not yet fully stepped into your new identity. This creates a silent loneliness that few people understand. Even though the apostles walked together, each one carried his own internal battle, because transformation is personal. It cannot be delegated, it cannot be shared, it must be lived individually. Peter, for example, was not just learning to follow Jesus. He was learning to become someone entirely different from the impulsive fisherman he once was. But that transformation did not happen overnight. There were moments when his old nature surfaced, moments of fear, moments of denial, moments of reaction. And each time, he was confronted with the reality that being chosen does not mean being perfect. It means being in process. And that process can be uncomfortable. It can feel like you are constantly failing, like you are not progressing fast enough, like you are not worthy of the calling you have received. This internal pressure becomes another layer of testing. Because the apostles were not only dealing with external opposition, they were dealing with internal expectations, the expectation to live up to what they had been called to do, the expectation to represent something greater than themselves, the expectation to not fail, and yet failure was part of their journey, repeatedly, and every failure forced them to confront a deeper truth. Their calling was not based on their ability, but on their willingness to continue. Another aspect of this burden was the way they were perceived by others. Being chosen meant being misunderstood. It meant being judged. It meant being rejected. People who once knew them could no longer relate to them. Their priorities had changed, their focus had shifted, their values had been transformed, and this created distance, not just physically but relationally. Imagine trying to explain to someone why you left everything to follow a man who speaks about unseen kingdoms. Imagine the skepticism, the doubt, the criticism. The apostles faced this constantly. And this adds another layer to their daily trial, because rejection is not easy, especially when it comes from people you once belonged to. But calling often requires separation, not because you are better than others, but because your direction is different. And that difference creates tension. The apostles had to learn to be comfortable with being misunderstood. They had to accept that not everyone would understand their path. And this is one of the hardest lessons for anyone walking a spiritual journey, because we naturally seek validation. We want others to understand us, to support us, to affirm us. But the apostles were being trained to find their identity not in human approval, but in divine purpose. And that shift is not easy. It requires letting go of the need to be accepted by everyone. It requires standing firm, even when others question you. It requires trusting your calling, even when it isolates you. And isolation is another hidden trial. Not necessarily physical isolation, but emotional and spiritual isolation. The feeling that you are walking a path that few can relate to. The sense that your experiences are difficult to explain. The awareness that your struggles are not always visible to others. The apostles experienced this deeply, because even among themselves, each one had a unique journey. Each one had different doubts, different fears, different areas of growth, and yet they had to continue moving forward. Another layer of this burden is responsibility. Being chosen comes with responsibility, not just to follow, but to represent, not just to believe, but to embody. The apostles were not only learning from Jesus, they were being shaped to carry his message forward, and that awareness creates pressure, because it is one thing to believe something privately, it is another to live it publicly. Every action, every word, every decision becomes significant, and this can feel overwhelming, because the weight of responsibility can create fear. Fear of making mistakes, fear of not doing enough, fear of falling short, and yet this fear becomes another test. Will you allow the weight of responsibility to paralyze you, or will you allow it to refine you? The apostles had to learn this balance. They had to learn that responsibility is not about perfection, but about faithfulness, not about never failing, but about always returning. And this is where their transformation deepens, because the burden of being chosen is not meant to break you. It is meant to shape you. It is meant to strip away everything that is not aligned with your purpose. It is meant to refine your character, strengthen your resilience, and deepen your faith. But this process is not comfortable. It involves loss. It involves change, it involves uncertainty, and that is why it is a daily trial. Because every day, the apostles had to choose again, to continue walking, to continue trusting, to continue letting go of what they once were in order to become what they were called to be. And this is where the real transformation happens. Not in the moments of certainty, but in the moments of struggle. Not when everything makes sense, but when it doesn't, because that is when faith becomes real. That is when identity is solidified. That is when purpose takes root. The apostles did not become who they were overnight. They became who they were through daily surrender, through daily struggle, through daily decisions to keep going despite everything that tried to pull them back. And that is the second hidden trial. The burden of being chosen, the weight of being set apart, the challenge of leaving behind the old while stepping into the new. A process that is as painful as it is powerful, and one that ultimately transforms ordinary people into vessels of extraordinary purpose. There is a level of pressure that most people will never fully understand, a kind of fear that does not appear all at once, but lingers, quietly, persistently, shaping every thought, every decision, every step forward. This was the reality the apostles lived in daily, not just occasional danger, not just isolated threats, but a constant awareness that following Jesus could cost them everything, including their lives. And this was not a distant possibility, it was real, it was immediate, it was unavoidable. From the moment they chose to follow him, they stepped into a path that led not to comfort, but to confrontation, not to safety, but to sacrifice. And this created one of the most intense and secret trials of their faith, the daily confrontation with fear. Because courage is often misunderstood. People think courage means not feeling fear. But the truth is, courage is the decision to move forward despite fear. And the apostles felt fear deeply. They were human. They understood pain. They understood loss. They understood what it meant to be hunted, rejected, threatened. They saw what happened to others who opposed authority. They lived under a system where power was enforced through violence, and yet they were called to speak a message that challenged that very system. This created a tension that was not just external, but internal. Because every time they spoke, every time they preached, every time they stood for truth, they were aware of the risk. And that awareness does something to the mind. It creates hesitation, it creates doubt, it whispers questions like, is it worth it? How far should I go? What if this leads to my death? And these are not easy questions to answer, especially when the consequences are so severe. The apostles had to face this daily, not once, not occasionally, but constantly. And one of the most powerful moments that reveals this struggle is what happened after Jesus was arrested. The same men who had walked with him, who had witnessed miracles, who had declared loyalty, suddenly found themselves overwhelmed by fear. They scattered, they hid. Peter, the bold one, the one who said he would never abandon Jesus, denied him 3 times, and this moment is crucial because it reveals the depth of their humanity. It shows that even those who are chosen, even those who are close to truth, are not immune to fear. Fear can shake anyone. Fear can break confidence. Fear can cause even the strongest person to hesitate. And this is one of the most painful internal trials. The realization that your fear can override your faith in critical moments. That in the face of real danger, your instincts may pull you in the opposite direction of your calling. And this creates guilt. It creates shame. It creates internal conflict. Because you know what you believe, but your reaction does not always align with it. Peter felt this deeply. The weight of his denial was not just about the act itself, but about what it revealed inside him. That fear still had a grip on him, that his faith, while real, was not yet fully matured. And this is the hidden process of transformation. Because failure exposes what still needs to be refined, it reveals the areas where growth is still necessary. And while this is painful, it is also essential, because without exposure, there can be no transformation. The apostles had to confront their fear, not avoid it. They had to see it clearly, feel it deeply, and then learn to move beyond it. But this is not an instant process. It is gradual. It is repetitive. It is built through experience. Another layer of this trial was the unpredictability of their situation. They did not know when persecution would come. They did not know who would betray them. They did not know when they would be arrested, beaten, or killed. This constant uncertainty creates a psychological pressure that is difficult to describe, because the mind is always alert, always anticipating, always preparing for the worst, and this can be exhausting. Living in a state of constant vigilance drains emotional energy. It challenges mental stability. It forces you to confront the reality that your future is not guaranteed. And yet, despite this, they had to continue. They had to keep preaching, keep moving, keep trusting. And this is where faith becomes more than belief. It becomes endurance, because believing in something when everything is safe is one thing. But continuing to believe when your life is at risk is something entirely different. It requires a deeper level of commitment, a level that goes beyond emotion, beyond temporary inspiration. It becomes a conviction that anchors you even in the face of death. And this is where the apostles were being shaped, not just to believe, but to stand, not just to follow, but to endure. And endurance is built through pressure. It is built through repeated exposure to fear and the decision to move forward anyway. Another powerful example of this trial is seen in their imprisonment. When they were arrested, beaten, and threatened, they had a choice. They could stop. They could remain silent. They could choose safety over purpose. And this is a very real temptation. Because survival instinct is strong. It pushes you to avoid pain, to protect yourself, to seek security. But the apostles were being trained to prioritize something greater than survival. They were being trained to value truth above comfort, purpose above safety. And this is not natural. It goes against instinct. It requires a transformation of perspective, a shift in what you value most. And this shift does not happen easily. It is forged through experience, through confrontation, through moments where you are forced to choose between fear and faith. And every time they chose faith, something inside them became stronger. not because the fear disappeared, but because their response to fear changed. They began to see fear not as a signal to stop, but as a test to overcome. They began to understand that fear is not the enemy, but the environment in which faith is proven. And this realization changes everything, because instead of being controlled by fear, they began to move through it. They began to act despite it. They began to speak even when their voice trembled. And that is real courage. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to act anyway. And over time, this repeated decision created a transformation. The same men who once hid behind locked doors became bold proclaimers of truth. The same men who feared death began to face it with peace, not because they were fearless, but because their faith had grown stronger than their fear. And this is the ultimate outcome of this trial, not the elimination of fear, but the elevation of faith, a faith that is not shaken by external threats. A faith that is not dependent on safety, a faith that stands firm even in the face of suffering. And this is what made the apostles extraordinary. Not that they never felt fear, but that they learned to move beyond it, that they allowed their fear to become a catalyst for growth rather than a barrier to action. And this is a lesson that extends far beyond their time, because the same trial exists today. The fear of rejection, the fear of loss, the fear of stepping into something unknown, the fear of what following your calling might cost you. These fears are real, they are powerful, they are persistent, but they are also part of the process. Because without fear, there is no opportunity for courage. Without risk, there is no opportunity for faith to be tested. And without testing, there is no transformation. The apostles lived this reality every day, and through that daily confrontation with fear, they were shaped into something greater than they ever imagined. Not because their path was easy, but because it was difficult. Not because they avoided trials, but because they endured them. And that is the third hidden trial. The constant shadow of suffering, the daily awareness of risk, the internal battle between fear and faith, a battle that did not destroy them, but ultimately revealed the depth of what they truly believed. There is a kind of trial that is more dangerous than persecution, more painful than rejection, and more destabilizing than fear. It is not loud, it is not visible, it does not come from outside. It comes from within. It is the moment when faith feels distant, when clarity disappears, when even those who walk closely with truth begin to feel an unexplainable silence inside their souls. This was one of the most hidden and profound trials the apostles faced daily. The internal void, the moments where they felt spiritually lost, disconnected, and uncertain despite everything they had seen. Because contrary to what many believe, witnessing miracles does not eliminate inner struggle. Hearing truth does not automatically remove confusion. Walking with Jesus did not mean they always felt strong, secure, or certain. In fact, many times it created even deeper questions. Because the closer they got to truth, the more their old understanding began to collapse. And when old frameworks collapse, there is always a period of disorientation, a space where nothing feels fully clear, a space where faith is no longer sustained by emotion, but must be held by decision alone. And this is one of the most difficult places to exist, because it feels like you are walking without support, like you are moving forward without reassurance, like you are believing without feeling. The apostles experienced this more than most people realize. There were moments when Jesus spoke in ways they could not understand, parables that confused them, teachings that challenged everything they thought they knew, statements that seemed paradoxical, even contradictory to their expectations. And instead of immediate clarity, they often found themselves in silence, processing, questioning, trying to make sense of something that did not fit their current perspective. And this created a deep internal tension, because the mind seeks understanding. It wants things to make sense. It wants to connect the dots, but faith often requires you to move forward before all the dots are connected. and that creates discomfort. It creates uncertainty. It creates a sense of instability. Another layer of this trial was the emotional experience of distance. Even while physically close to Jesus, there were moments when they did not fully feel what they expected to feel. Moments where doubt crept in quietly, not as rebellion, but as uncertainty. Questions like, do we truly understand what is happening? Are we on the right path? Why does this not feel clearer? These are not questions of disbelief, but of depth. They emerge when a person is growing beyond surface-level faith and entering a deeper, more complex relationship with truth. And that depth is not always comfortable. It requires letting go of simple answers. It requires accepting that not everything will be immediately clear. It requires trusting even when your emotions do not align with your belief. This is the essence of spiritual maturity, but it is also one of the most difficult transitions to make because emotions are powerful. They influence perception, they shape experience, and when emotions are not aligned with faith, it creates internal conflict. The apostles had to learn how to navigate this. They had to learn how to remain grounded even when they felt uncertain, how to continue believing even when they did not feel strong. And this is not easy, because most people rely on feelings as confirmation. If they feel peace, they believe they are on the right path. If they feel confusion, they assume something is wrong. But the apostles were being trained in a deeper principle, that truth is not dependent on feeling, that faith is not validated by emotion, that sometimes the absence of feeling is part of the process. This is especially evident in the moments leading up to Jesus' crucifixion. The tension, the confusion, the emotional weight of what was happening created a level of internal struggle that is difficult to fully comprehend. They had followed him. They had believed in him. They had built their entire understanding of the future around him, and suddenly everything seemed to collapse. The one they trusted was arrested. The one they believed in was condemned. The one they thought would establish a kingdom was being led to death. This moment shattered their expectations. It broke their understanding. It created a void that no immediate answer could fill. And in that void, doubt intensified. Not necessarily doubt about who Jesus was, but doubt about what was happening, about how this could make sense, about how something so powerful could lead to something so devastating. And this is where faith is tested at its deepest level, not when things are difficult, but when they seem contradictory, when reality does not align with expectation, when the outcome looks like failure instead of fulfillment. And in those moments, it is easy to feel abandoned, to feel like the connection is gone, like the presence you once felt is no longer there. The apostles experienced this in a very real way. After the crucifixion, there was silence, no explanations, no immediate resolution, just emptiness, just confusion, just the weight of everything they had witnessed. And in that silence, they had to confront their faith in a completely new way. Because now, it was not supported by visible miracles. It was not reinforced by direct guidance. It existed in uncertainty. And this is one of the most intense spiritual trials, the moment when you must continue to believe without immediate evidence, when you must hold on without feeling held, when you must trust without understanding. This is where many people give up, because the absence of clarity feels like absence of truth. But the apostles were being shaped in this very space, because true faith is not built in moments of constant reassurance. It is built in moments of silence. In moments where you have nothing to rely on except your decision to believe. And slowly, through this process, something began to change inside them. Their faith began to detach from external validation. It became internal, rooted, stable. Not because everything made sense, but because they chose to trust beyond what they could explain. And this is the transformation that happens in the void. The space that feels empty is actually a space of formation. A space where shallow belief is stripped away and deeper conviction is built. But this process is not comfortable. It feels like loss. It feels like confusion. It feels like disconnection. And yet it is necessary, because without it, faith remains fragile, dependent on circumstances, dependent on feelings, dependent on constant reinforcement. The apostles had to move beyond that. They had to develop a faith that could survive silence, that could endure confusion, that could stand even when everything felt uncertain. And that is the fourth hidden trial. The inner void, the moments of doubt, the feeling of spiritual distance, not as a sign of failure, but as a stage of growth. A process that deepens faith in a way that comfort never could. A process that transforms belief from something emotional into something unshakable. And in that transformation, the apostles became stronger. Not because they always felt connected, but because they learned how to remain faithful even when they didn't. There comes a point in every true spiritual journey where belief is no longer enough, where understanding reaches its limit, where effort alone cannot carry you any further. It is the point where something deeper is required, something more costly, something more final. This is the place where the apostles were ultimately led, not just to follow, not just to believe, not just to endure, but to surrender completely. And this surrender was not symbolic, it was not poetic, it was real, painful, and absolute. It was the death of the self. The final and most hidden trial they faced daily was not external opposition, not fear, not doubt, but the constant call to let go of who they were at the deepest level. Because as long as the self remains in control, faith remains limited. As long as identity is rooted in personal desire, fear will always have power. As long as there is something to protect, something to preserve, something to hold on to, surrender remains incomplete. And this is where the apostles were being taken step by step, not forced but invited, not instantly but progressively, because the death of the self is not a single moment. It is a continuous process, a daily decision, a repeated surrender. Every time they chose obedience over comfort, a part of the old self died. Every time they chose truth over safety, another layer was stripped away. Every time they chose to trust instead of control, they moved deeper into this transformation. And this process is not easy, because the self resists. It clings to identity, to recognition, to certainty, to control. It wants to be seen, to be validated, to be secure, and yet the path they were walking required the opposite. It required humility. It required anonymity. It required sacrifice. It required a willingness to lose everything, even their own lives. And this creates a deep internal conflict, because the instinct to survive is strong. The desire to preserve oneself is natural, but the apostles were being trained to live from a different center, a place where identity is not based on survival, but on purpose, where value is not measured by comfort, but by alignment, where life is not defined by what you keep, but by what you are willing to give. And this shift is radical. It changes everything. Because once the self begins to lose its grip, fear loses its foundation. What can you threaten in someone who has already surrendered everything? What can you take from someone who no longer defines themselves by what they possess? What can you destroy in someone whose identity is no longer rooted in the external? This is where unshakable faith is born. Not in moments of ease, but in moments of surrender. Not when everything is gained, but when everything is released. The apostles did not reach this level overnight. It was built through every trial they faced, through every moment of fear, every experience of doubt, every season of confusion. All of it was leading them to this final transformation, the understanding that their lives were no longer their own, that their purpose was greater than their personal desires, that their calling required total surrender, and this realization is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it removes control, liberating because it removes fear. Because once control is surrendered, the pressure to manage everything disappears. Once the self is released, The need to protect it fades, and what remains is a deep, stable, unshakable peace. Not because circumstances are easy, but because identity is no longer tied to them. This is the state the apostles began to step into after everything they had been through, after the fear, after the doubt, after the confusion, after the failure. They emerged different, not just stronger, but transformed at their core. The same men who once struggled to understand, who once reacted in fear, who once questioned everything, now stood with clarity, boldness, and peace. Not because they had all the answers, but because they no longer needed them. Their faith was no longer dependent on understanding. It was anchored in surrender, and this is what allowed them to face what came next. Persecution intensified. Threats became more real. Death was no longer a distant possibility, it was an approaching reality, and yet something had changed inside them. The fear that once controlled them no longer had the same power. The uncertainty that once shook them no longer destabilized them, because they had already faced the deepest loss, the loss of the self, and once that is gone, everything else loses its grip. This is why they could stand firm in the face of death, not because they were fearless in the human sense, but because they were no longer attached in the same way. Their lives were no longer centered around self-preservation. They were centered around purpose, and purpose is stronger than fear. Purpose gives meaning to sacrifice. It gives direction to suffering. It transforms pain into something valuable. And this is what sustained them. This is what carried them forward. This is what allowed them to continue even when everything around them suggested they should stop. And this is the final and greatest transformation. When faith moves beyond belief and becomes identity, when surrender is no longer something you struggle with but something you live from, when the need for control is replaced by trust, when the fear of loss is replaced by peace, and this is not a state that is reached once and for all, it is maintained daily, because the self always tries to return. The desire for control, for recognition, for comfort, for security, it does not disappear completely. It must be surrendered again and again. And this is why this trial is daily. Because surrender is daily, faith is daily, transformation is daily. The apostles lived this reality continuously, and through it they became something that could not be shaken, not because they were immune to struggle, but because they had been shaped by it, refined by it, transformed through it. And this is the secret behind their strength, not perfection, not certainty, not ease, but surrender. A complete, ongoing, unwavering surrender that allowed them to stand firm no matter what came against them. And this is the final hidden trial, the death of the self, the letting go of control, the release of identity as they once knew it. A process that feels like loss, but is actually the beginning of something far greater. Because on the other side of that surrender is a faith that cannot be shaken, a faith that does not depend on circumstances, a faith that remains even in silence, even in suffering, even in the face of death. And that is what the apostles ultimately became. Not just followers, not just believers, but living expressions of a faith that had been tested, refined, and made unbreakable.